step 2, chapter 2, according to the romance, is that among the ladies of the court, the noble women, the daughters of noblemen who lived in Toledo, was a woman called Lacaba, and then later on she's also referred to as Florinda. So Lacaba would presumably derive from an Arab word, so say certain etymologists, meaning whore or bad woman. But it also can't be ignored that there's this clear assonance with the cave, la cava, in Spanish cueva, so Latin-derived word. And Florinda, of course, refers to flowers, and in fact she's constantly referred to in the context of a beautiful watering hole, very common femininity-related symbolism, and flowers, and her also splendid accompaniers, her maids, other noblewomen. Now Don Rodrigo apparently creeps up on the watering hole, the whatever it is, the small body of water where she's bathing with her ladies, and watches her, and wants her, desires her sexually. He leans against a tree, so the imagery of the tree as a symbol of royal power, a kind of axis mundi, as well as the tree of the Garden of Eden. But here it's a symbol of his weakness. He leans against it because he can't keep himself up because of his lust. And in fact, it's very interesting because, of course, we get this idea that because of his desire, his whole concept of nature has been defiled. So he describes the flowers, he describes the tree, he describes all of the natural beauty as ugly or as useless. In the romance, this is a very clear sign that his perception of nature is somehow stunted. Another interesting element here that I think is worth bringing up in the context of the tree is that Don Rodrigo is described in terms of the 4 elements. So in terms of the 4 Empedoclean constituents of reality, he says, my water is all in my tears, my wind is all in my sighs, my fire is all in my chest, and that the ground, the earth itself, looks to him like a sepulcher, a grave, a place to be buried. So just as the axis mundi, the 5th element in a way, the center between the 4 cardinal points, is a useless tree, a useless oak, he describes it as, his 4 elements are all out of order. They are somehow perverted. So the realm is out of order because the king is so disordered. He finally makes his advance, and Florinda tries to get him to stop, and she uses fascinating imagery. She uses, for example, the image of a bloody moon eclipsing the sun, and of humor, as in liquid, moisture, weighing down the king and the king's virility. So this is actually very much an alchemical, hermetic kind of symbolism, because it's about the moon, that which is merely reflective, merely passive, as distinct from the sun, which shines by its own light, and moisture, and blood specifically, which of course is a reference to her being about to lose her virginity because he might try to rape her, dampening resolve, dampening a clear vision, dampening a lucid awareness, which the king is supposed to have. So these are all symbols that one finds generally associated with alchemy. He does rape her, although the romance is not clear as to whether she may be acquiesced at some point, because he promises her a marriage in the future. Whatever happened, he doesn't marry her. He refuses her. Her family is not wealthy enough, in some accounts, for him to think that they warrant him marrying into them. So she sends a rotten egg as a symbol of her defilement in the mail, whatever mail service existed at the time. By the way, we're talking 8th century, 700s. To her father. Her father is obviously a nobleman. Her father is stationed down south in a Spanish enclave, which is still Spanish to this day, in North Africa, called the city of Ceuta. Now, in Ceuta, the father, whose name is Don Julian, and in some accounts he was part of the supporters of Witiza, so he would have reason to dislike Rodrigo anyway, receives this rotten egg and immediately understands what it means. And so he thinks to himself, well, this guy's raped my daughter, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ally with someone who can help me against him, help me take the kingdom away from him. And who better than the folks that I'm here fighting? In fact, we hear that Don Julian, in that little enclave, is fighting against heathens. He's fighting against Muslims. By now, the Muslims have established themselves in much of North Africa. At one point, when Florinda was trying to get Don Rodrigo not to advance on her inappropriately, she said something to the effect of, you will be defiling the daughter of a man who's fighting for you against the infidels. And in doing so, you will become the infidel. And it will seem as though they are more righteous, or something to that effect. In other words, he has placed himself in the place of the infidel. And in fact, this is pointing to the idea of the conquest as a purging brought about by illegitimate government, oppressive government, illegitimate behavior on the part of a king. When the letter or the package with the rotten egg first goes out from Florinda to her father in North Africa, the romance says that a basilisk was leaving the palace where Florinda lived to her father. When her father comes into Spain with his Muslim allies to dethrone Rodrigo, we hear the romance says that he comes with a Libyan viper. So this idea of the snake, which is a powerful element of energy, Hercules had defeated the snake and built a temple or a tower on top of it, which had at some point been Christianized. But in this case, because Rodrigo has not accepted the chastisement, the putting of the lock on the gate of the tower, the snake power is what it was initially. It's a ferocious, devouring thing. It leaves as a basilisk. It comes back as a Libyan viper, meaning it's coming from North Africa to invade. So I think it's this idea as well. Later versions, modern versions, Lope de Vega, for example, his poetic rendition describes the king as a naked tree, a destroyed tree. So the idea of the tree and the snake are very present throughout, because he has not done things right. He is subject to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, essentially, and the snake. He eventually gets devoured by a snake. Anyway, Don Julian, depending on the account, he actually converts to Islam. But that's not the standard account. The standard account is that he just invites in the Arab-led invasion. They come, they defeat Don Rodrigo in the famous Battle of Guadalete, it's called. And he retreats from the battle defeated at some point. And despondent, now realizing what he's done, because he's violated both the cave and Florinda, he sees a shepherd calls the shepherd to him and asks the shepherd if there might be any religious structure nearby where he can take solace, where he can try to repent for his sins. And the shepherd says there is a hermitage nearby. Now, at this point, he dispossesses himself. He gives the shepherd his rings, his jewelry. The shepherd in return gives him plain bread. He weeps for the plainness of the bread compared to the feasts he's used to consuming. So this is a moment of purging, which relates back to the key. The lock you put on the Tower of the Mysteries, the Tower of the Holy Grail, the Tower of the Treasure of Hercules, the Tower of the Defeated Serpent, the Tower of the Table of Solomon, is a chastity lock in a way. It is a purgation. It's kind of like the 40 days fasting in the gospel. It's accepting the discipline of asceticism, whereas Don Rodrigo did not accept that. Now it comes to him. Now he's dispossessed. He's lost his kingdom, he's lost his jewelry, and he has only bread to eat. So he finally finds the hermitage, because the shepherd led him. So a humble shepherd leads a king, or a former king. And the monk there hears his account and tells him, this is how you're going to redeem yourself, atone for your sins. You are going to spend, and he actually has a dream in which this formula for atonement comes to him. The monk does. He says to Rodrigo, you're going to enter into a sepulcher, a tomb, with a snake, and you're going to spend several days, 3 days is how the romance says, so it's kind of like the tomb of Christ. 3 days in there. And that's how you're going to attain your redemption. So he does that. And the snake eats him. It eats him starting from the organ wherein his sin began, his genitals, up to his heart. And he says, in the romance, the verses are La cava me acaba. The La cava, the woman, finishes me. So it rhymes in Spanish. In other words, his lust for her is his undoing. It caused disaster. It was his failing. But in some accounts, interestingly, the snake has 2 heads. It's a bicephalous snake, so it's kind of like, in a way, it's a parody of the 2-headed eagle of power. But the bicephalous snake, interestingly, comes up a lot in Spanish folklore. And in those accounts, one head eats his nether regions, and the other one eats his heart. So one eats his, let's say, the extroversion of sin, and the other one the introversion. And in fact, in some accounts, in some chronicles, Christian chronicles, it says that, one was the act and the other the will. St. Paul in Corinthians at one point, I don't remember where, maybe it's 1 Corinthians 1:22, but I don't remember. He says something like that the Hellenes, they look for reasons, they're always thinking, whereas the Hebrews, they look for signs, they look for omens. But the Christ, the living Christ, is neither of those two. And this idea comes up in different traditions, not only the Christian one. The idea that there's 2 ways of going wrong. One is the act, the extroversion, the looking for satisfaction outside, and the other one is the will, twisting the reason or the will in a bad direction, and they will often manifest together. Now, there's a lot of versed song and poetry in different regions of Spain that have nothing to do with Rodrigo. When my great-grandparents were younger, this was prominent. Now probably it's not, but it was recorded by anthropologists, recent anthropologists. So we have a lot of these written down. of the atonement by snake. People who commit a sin, they enter into a sepulcher, and the snake eats them. Sometimes the snake has 7 heads, weirdly. Kind of like the 7-headed Naga king who sort of guards the Buddha when he meditates, for example. So there's something there. Sometimes it has 2. Sometimes it has 1 head, but it's 7 lengths long, and it sort of eats you in 7 periods. So it's like the ascent in 7. I won't get into that imagery too much because there's actually a lot to that, but this is a sort of common theme, weirdly. I'm sure it appears in other countries as well. So Don Rodrigo is dead. That's the end of him. There's a story according to which Florinda flees to her father's holiday home, which is in the south of Spain, and finding that she is pregnant with Don Rodrigo's son, stays safe for a while, but eventually the Muslim troops find her and determine that because she bears the likely heir to the Visigothic monarchy, they ought to extinguish that future threat, and they execute the child, and she throws herself into a well. And there are stories according to which that well into which she threw herself, so she's related to water again, kind of like the Arthurian Lady of the Lake, but darker. She appeared for a period of time, either once a year for many years or whatever it was, and eventually was purged of her suicide and was allowed into heaven, and that the locals saw it. Now, there's a town, I don't recall the name, in Andalusia. They tell you where the well is. It's named after La Cava. There's a street named Florinda. I mean, they have this story. It's very much part of their identity in this town. To this day, you can go there and it's named that way, and they say that this all happened. So Florinda is allowed into heaven despite her suicide, and presumably Rodrigo has also purged himself of his sin. The son is said to remain as an infant ghost, and if children go by that way, he appears to them and they die, and they join his ghost army to fight and scare the invader until one day Spain is restored. Now, the second part of the romance would be Don Pelayo, a nobleman whose father was blinded by Witiza back in the day, so no friend of Witiza, but who obviously disagrees with Rodrigo's carrying on, who got established actually in the most remote part of Spain, up in Asturias, because Witiza didn't want him anywhere near him because he didn't like his father, but he couldn't go after the son for reasons of public relations, so he established him way up in the north in this backwater, rainy little part of the Atlantic coast on Spain, left him there as a tax collector. But eventually, this guy will lead the Reconquista. Interestingly, the English romantic, Southey, writes an account of the Reconquista in which Rodrigo goes to fight with Don Pelayo, with this guy, at that initial battle that starts the Reconquista before he goes to do his penance, his final penance in a monastery, and is reconciled with Florinda, who remains alive. So Southey tried to tie a lot of this together. I won't get into the story of Don Pelayo, but just to focus on the story, the romance of Don Rodrigo and Florinda, a few things are really interesting. But the main thing that I would highlight is the idea that the cave, putting the lock on the cave, accepting your limits in order to then receive legitimacy, is kind of like the purgation. It's kind of like the death and rebirth ritual of many traditions. And the cave is a maternal presence. It's very similar to the idea of incubation in caves, of spending long periods of time in isolation, in the darkness in caves. This is Taoist, this is Greek as well. Enkeoimises or something like that it's called in Greek, the incubation rituals that presumably philosophers engaged in as well. This kind of rebirth from the womb of the world, which is a cave. And then the lover. But you can't have the divine feminine as flower, as flowering, Florinda, if you don't first die and get reborn, if you don't become a son of the divine feminine as mother. Hercules earns his name after Hera. Through the 12 trials, he's kind of adopted by Hera. She finally stops opposing him. And then he receives the cupbearer, Hebe, the cupbearer of the gods, as a wife. A grail woman, kind of, a grail maiden. Very clear parallel there, which reminds us again of the flower, Florinda as flower lady. Well, the flower is also kind of a grail, because in ancient Egyptian imagery, it's often a divine lady that gives a lotus flower to a king. So there's some relation there. The cave and the grail, the mother and the wife are related, but you have to get the order right. And since he rejects death and rebirth, he's not ready for a wife. He's not able to relate properly to woman. So he rapes or pressures or lies to Florinda and doesn't honor his marriage promise to her. So there is something about spiritual initiation there. It's all in the Christian context. So we have all of these kinds of ideas, especially the relation to Hercules, brought into a Christian story. All right. So that I thought that was interesting. Probably going to be making more videos like this for this channel. I don't want to let the channel agonize forever. I know that I haven't really produced new content in a long time. I'm very bad at that. Anyway, I'm going to try a little harder. Comment if you thought this was interesting, or if not, or if there's any aspect that I could go into a little more. I wanted to share this because I do feel like these stories deserve to be heard more. I've tried to go into the deeper meaning a little bit of these stories, which is clearly there.